and truly it is a pleasure to be able to join all of you. This year, as we observe the International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief, the situation of Afghanistan weighs heavily on our hearts. Horrific scenes of people trying in utter desperation to leave the country are seared in our minds. Our newspapers, the televisions are full of it. The ethnic and religious minorities, the Hazaras, the Christians, the Sikhs, the Hindus, are particularly vulnerable. According to a tweet by journalists reporting on the situation, the Taliban had sent out letters to church leaders warning, "We know who you are and we are coming for you." And while what is happening in Afghanistan requires our attention, our efforts, and our prayers, it is sadly not the only place where religious minorities are in danger. According to a 2018 Pew Forum report, a survey, it was the last year that survey was the results out of, a total number of countries with high or very high levels of government restrictions stood at 56 countries. 56. That was 28% of all the countries surveyed. In addition to the countries with high or very high levels of social hostility involving religion, the number stood at 53 in 2018. That was 27% of all the countries studied. India's own score is not too good. India stood at, the index was out of social hostilities, was at 9.6 out of 10, in part because of the mob violence that we see happen so frequently and hostilities over conversions. India also ranked very high on government restrictions. In fact, the score stood at 5.9 out of 10. And sadly, this is also reflected in the more recent data collated by human rights organizations, including government data. The problem persists, both in terms of social hostility, but also government restrictions. The International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief is an important reminder that nation states have the primary responsibility to promote and protect human rights, including the human rights of persons belonging to religious minorities, especially their right to exercise their religion or belief freely. Any act targeting religious minorities should be met with strict legal action and public outcry. However, sadly, that is often not the case. Victims of communal violence have repeatedly accused the state machinery, especially the police, of failing to protect them. Weak and even sometimes complicit institutions have compounded the problem. To give you an example, Meera Ben was 8 months pregnant when she gathered along with a small group of Christians to worship at the start of this year in the state of Madhya Pradesh. It was New Year's Eve. The families had gathered for prayer to usher in the new year. There was so much excitement with the pregnancy. And soon that was dissipated as a mob attacked. The mob accused the Christians of trying to convert local Hindus. They were attacked with sticks. They had stones pelted on them. Meera was pushed down to the ground. She was 8 months pregnant, visibly pregnant. She was kicked repeatedly, and she does not know the time when she became unconscious. Some hours later, as friends and family traveled to the hospital to get Meera the attention she needed, she gave birth to a stillborn baby, a baby boy. Far from taking action against members of the mob who had been clearly identified by the Christians, the police threatened to arrest the Christians instead. Their crime, according to the police, was the Bibles they had in their possession were evidence of conversion. The police did not register a case against the mob for the violence against Meera Ben or the killing of that little baby boy. 8 months on, Meera Ben and her attorney, a group of social activists associated with ADF, still struggle to get their case heard. That little 8-month-old baby in the womb, actually 8 months, not even 8 months, sorry, and his family are victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. This day is dedicated to them. And yet, not all the blame can rest on political and legal institutions, for they operate in a culture. Far too often, we have stayed quiet when fellow citizens who are Dalits, tribals, women, religious minorities have been attacked. We have acted out of fear, out of indifference, or perhaps even worse, when we believe that this violence or discrimination is somehow deserved. Dr. Ambedkar talked about the idea of fraternity. He said it was the bedrock on which other essential values such as liberty and equality will flourish. Without it, Dr. Ambedkar said, liberty and equality could not become the natural course of things. It would require a constable to enforce them. Fraternity compels us to speak up for those who are different. It recognizes our interdependence as citizens, that it is for the common good, and it is to be nurtured by creating spaces for each other. The Constitution of India in the Hindi language uses this very beautiful term, bandhutva, for fraternity. Bandhutva draws on the concept of being bound together, being knitted together in friendship and in love. It is a very powerful vision for a nation whose citizens work together for the good of each other. Today is also Raksha Bandhan, a day when brothers and sisters across India celebrate or pledge rather to protect each other. And it is important that we think about ways that we can pledge or that we can protect the rights of our fellow citizens. What will it take for us to increase this fraternity in our nation? On this International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief, let us pledge to work together towards better implementation of legal protections, but also to increase interfaith efforts so that we may combat such horrific incidents of discrimination and violence. We thank you for joining ADF India in these efforts. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, bonjour, namaste, assalamu alaikum. Now, please allow me to express my gratitude for the honor bestowed by ADF India in permitting me to speak at this important event, part of your campaign, and also for the Commemoration Day for victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. It was actually on this day, just 2 years ago in 2019, that the United Nations General Assembly designated the 22nd of August as the International Day commemorating the victims of violence, of acts of violence based on religion or belief. And partly it was in recognition of the importance of providing victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief and members of their families with appropriate support and assistance in accordance with applicable law. At the time, it strongly deplored all acts of violence against persons on the basis of their religion or belief, as well as any acts that were directed against their homes, properties, cultural centers, or places of worship, as well as all attacks on and in religious places and shrines that were breaches of international human rights law. And in a sense, by proclaiming an international day on this day, the General Assembly wanted to remind states that they have the primary responsibility to promote and protect human rights, including, and I would say even especially, the human rights of persons belonging to religious minorities. But also, at the same time, that it was seriously concerned at continuing acts of intolerance and violence based on the religion or belief against individuals, including, once again, obviously, persons belonging to religious minorities around the world. And at the same time, a few years ago, it was extremely concerned with the increasing number and intensity of such acts of violence. Now, before I begin, I wanted to express also my heartfelt concerns at the horrific situation and images most of you will have seen coming from Afghanistan, as Temina just mentioned. The chaos, the fear, and even violence we are seeing are difficult. And the scenes of despair also have, as many of you know, a religious dimension, which is perhaps not always sufficiently acknowledged, even at the United Nations and others. Women, human rights defenders, and those closely associated with Western powers and international organizations have and will probably eventually suffer perhaps even more the reprisals of the Taliban, despite commitments, contrary commitments made by the Taliban. But there are some who are even more vulnerable, even more at risk, and more likely to be persecuted, brutalized, and even executed. These are individuals who are brothers and sisters. They're fellow human beings, and they are more likely to be members of religious or belief minorities. The reality on the ground are that the Taliban are mainly Pashtun Sunnis, and minorities such as the Shia Hazara have already seen some of their members being tortured or killed in numbers in Afghanistan. And even before the Taliban, religious minorities such as the Sikhs and the Hindus were not recognized as citizens under the constitution of Afghanistan. Not only is that likely to continue, obviously, it's very likely that their situation will become much more precarious. And in fact, they are much more likely to be in danger. What will happen to the Sikhs, the Hindus, the Hazara minorities in the country now? Most of them are desperately trying to get out, but you have all seen what the situation is and how horrific and chaotic it is. Ladies and gentlemen, violence against religious or belief minorities is not limited to Afghanistan. It's a global phenomenon which seems to be increasing almost everywhere, fueled by the toxic environment created, amongst other things, by the proliferation of hate speech and prejudice, the xenophobia that is pushing extremist and even racist ideologies and threatening mainly minorities, again, as did propaganda before the Second World War in Europe. It is a phenomenon which can only be tackled through global collaboration and efforts including with multilateral international organizations that are dedicated to peace and justice, which are the pillars of the United Nations. But there cannot be peace without justice. And justice requires the protection of minorities against hate and persecution, as the international community before the Second World War failed at the time of the Holocaust against mainly religious minorities, such as Jews and other minorities, of course, including the Roma. So allow me to bring to your attention that the conditions that permit this increasing persecution and violence against minorities of religion or belief are often closely linked and to be found in the tsunami of hate against minorities that is flooding social media. In some countries, more than 3/4 of hate speech in social media target ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. And as a reminder, if reminder was needed, the Holocaust, and more specifically the Shoah, did not begin with gas chambers during the Second World War. It started with hate speech against Jews, a religious minority. The Nazis effectively used propaganda to win the support of millions of Germans to facilitate war and ultimately violence and genocide against the mainly Jewish and other minorities. Unfortunately, what do we have today? Well, today we are seeing social media platforms, which are again amplifying intolerance and prejudice, hate and violence, and therefore facilitating the propaganda of hate and racism, spewing at an incredible volume and speed to reach almost immediately millions of people, causing real harm, literally leading to individuals around the world being vilified, pointed out, lined up, lynched, and even massacred because they belong to dehumanized others, usually overwhelmingly minorities. And we are seeing again an upsurge of religious intolerance and nationalistic scapegoating against minorities, especially against religious minorities in countries such as India and Sri Lanka and Myanmar and many others, including in Europe and the Americas, where, for example, Muslim and Christian minorities are amongst those who are often blamed even for the spread of COVID or of being disloyal, alien, others, or somehow threats. Hate speech also creates fertile grounds for violence, attacks, and atrocities. As the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned when releasing the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, and here allow me to quote from him directly, quote, "Around the world, we are seeing a disturbing groundswell of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance. Public discourse is being weaponized for political gain with incendiary rhetoric that stigmatizes and dehumanizes minorities, migrants, refugees, women, and any so-called other," end of quote. There was a promise after the Second World War with the creation of the United Nations, and the promise was never again. And yet, we could almost say that this promise seems feeble as the horrific head of even genocidal acts rears again against minorities recently, as we've seen, in fact, in the situation of the Rohingya of Myanmar, a religious minority. Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we can emphasize enough that this is a global trend. One of the precursors of violence against religious or belief minorities is intolerance and exclusionary nationalism, of portraying minorities as outsiders, unwelcome, and even a threat to culture or society. You've all heard this. What has changed, which we have perhaps not adapted to sufficiently yet, is the speed and spread of acts of exclusion and even violence against minorities of religion or belief, which can be fueled like steroids by the tsunami of hate speech in social and other media, as it enters not only the world, but it also enters the minds, our minds. It's a kind of poison of the minds, which makes prejudice and intolerance more acceptable. And even in some countries, it is normalizing the persecution and violence against certain minorities. And again, as we've seen during the Second World War, in blaming others and scapegoating mainly minorities. Unfortunately, let's be honest, I think the responses of the international community remains resolutely analog when facing messages of hate and calls to genocide, to violence or genocide, targeting minorities in this digital world of social media. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Gypsyism, hatred and calls to violence against minorities is everywhere, almost everywhere, on the way up. So allow me to remind perhaps all of us, if we needed reminding, there are real world consequences to hate speech, of increased risks of violence and atrocities committed against minorities, once again around the world, often belief or religious minorities. And also there are more risks, I would say, of conflicts and even attempts at genocide. There is, and I think we should call it by its name, there is unfortunately at times seeming reluctance to highlight who are the main victims and targets of persecution here. Historically, they have been minorities often, perhaps even mainly religious or belief minorities. And we should not be timid in naming them. Jews, Sunnis, Shia, Tigrayan, Ahmadi, Dalits, Baha'is, Roma, Armenian, Tutsi, Assyrians, and others, and all of them minorities. Again, violence and atrocities and conflicts involving minorities have been increasing in recent years, not diminishing. And there seems to be, well, perhaps an absence or willingness of calling the beast by its name. As I have too often noticed, there is a kind of hesitancy, reluctance, even with international organizations, to refer to minorities in describing these contexts and conflicts. Some of you may remember there was a horrific incident situation in Afghanistan in May of this year, where a school was bombed, a school for girls in Afghanistan. I think there were more than 100 victims, 100 girls, students mainly, who had been killed. Very often, even I have to say, in the reporting of this horrific incident by the United Nations, we never or very seldom mentioned that the targets were not only girls. There were girls belonging to the Hazara minority, which had been specifically targeted in this terrorist action. Minorities are vulnerable, and unless we actually recognize that they are particularly doubly or triply vulnerable, we are not actually focusing enough on what is happening on the ground and the need to protect and to actually recognize that these victims of acts of violence are not everyone equally. They tend to be minorities in many parts of the world. So I take this opportunity to invite you also to participate, if you can, on the regional forum for the Asia Pacific region, being organized under my mandate on the theme of the prevention of conflict and the protection of the human rights of minorities, which is going to be held on the 7th and the 8th of September, just in a few months, therefore. And in this regional forum actually makes that connection that when we're seeing atrocities committed around the world and acts of violence, these atrocities and acts of violence tend to actually to involve minorities, and quite often religious minorities. And I think we need to focus on this particular dimension much more than we have been doing in recent years. So for the United Nations and other organizations and civil society, one of the keys to addressing violence against minorities of religion or belief is to recognize this reality on the ground and work towards the prevention of most contemporary conflicts, for example, by addressing the need, the essential role of the protection of minorities of belief or religion, as well as other forms of minorities. And I have to insist that the persecution and violence targeting religious or belief minorities occur in all types of political systems, as well as in all regions of the world. Democracies are not immune. I would almost dare to say that it's quite the opposite when you have politicians using majoritarian nationalism to whip up support among large numbers of followers by raising fear of the outsider again, the foreigner or the other, who is quite often from a minority. Nor is it limited to certain regions of the world. It occurs in Europe and in the Americas just as well as you know, in India, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, and many others. States must take concrete steps to address the increasing high levels of hate speech in social media much more effectively, because right now social media have become propaganda mediums of intolerance and even tools of incitement to violence and discrimination against minorities. This is happening all around us. And as many of you know, sometimes in some countries, state officials, because of their actions and sometimes inaction, are part of the problem instead of being part of the solution. That is why in my upcoming report to the United Nations General Assembly in New York next October, in a few months, I'm urging the United Nations and member states to begin work on a new treaty on hate speech in social media that needs to limit and describe how states must address hate without breaching the fundamental rights of all of us, such as freedom of expression. And particularly because we also need an international instrument that does not allow states to be able to abuse laws on hate speech to curtail the work of human rights defenders and those who legitimately criticize government policies and even government abuses. The United Nations role is, of course, to promote the human rights of everyone. But let me emphasize this point. It especially has a moral obligation to protect those who are the most vulnerable or who cannot protect themselves. If I may be so bold, it's clear that to address the global pandemic of hate and violence against minorities of religion or belief that we are experiencing around the world, that this requires global targeted responses. In line with the United Nations Plan of Action for religious leaders and actors to prevent and counter incitement to violence, perhaps the United Nations should explore setting up with regional organizations such as the African Union, the European Union, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation should look into a global plan of action against specifically persecution and violence against religious or belief minorities. They are the most vulnerable. They are the ones who urgently need a great deal of protection, much more than we are providing, or even the United Nations is providing currently. Furthermore, because the precursor of violence targeting minorities is hate, we need at the United Nations to consider further developing and using at all levels of its organization the detailed initiative known as the Rabat Plan of Action on the prohibition of advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, and which focuses very much on minorities of belief or religion. In my opinion, it incorporates what is called include a faith for rights toolkit, which in my opinion actually has a practical peer-to-peer guidelines on learning modules, including on addressing incitement to hatred and violence in the name of religion. And well, let's be bold. Let's be bold and urge that in order to tackle the scourge of increasing persecution and violence against minorities, and to strengthen the protection of minorities against denial of their human rights, let's be bold and suggest something along the lines of a kind of multilateral global inclusion minority initiative to try to measure, to assess, and provide sorely needed data on the treatment of minorities with the many offices of the United Nations in every region of the world. Because we don't have that information quite often. We don't have that data to actually understand the scope, the extent of persecution and violence and hate targeting minorities around the world. And if we don't know the scale of the problem, how can we actually have targeted, effective measures to deal with this? Finally, and not least, it would be worthwhile to consider a resolution, perhaps, moving towards a World Day for celebrating religious and belief diversity. Because to be on the positive side, our human diversity, including our religious diversity, is part of the beautiful tapestry that make us all humans, members of the same human family, even though we are very diverse, but our diversity is a richness that we should embrace rather than fear these differences. So this might be an opportunity to deepen our understanding of the values of religious and belief diversity and to learn to live together in harmony. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Dhanyavad. Shukriya.
So let me start with a Urdu couplet, and then I will give a very simple English translation. बड़े शौक से मेरे घर जला, कोई आंच तुझ पे ना आएगी, ये ज़बां किसी ने खरीद ली, ये कलम किसी का गुलाम है, यहाँ एक बच्चे के खून से जो लिखा हुआ है उसे पढ़ें, अभी कीर्तन तेरा पाप है, अभी मेरा सजदा हराम है। Put my house to flames without any hesitation. You won't be burned. My tongue has been bought and my pen has been enslaved. Read what is written with the blood of a baby. Your prayers and your worship and my prayers are basically prohibited. When I was a student and I was taught coming into being of the state, those famous theories about the origin of the state, which started with the divine theory that God created a state and went to the might theory, that in the state of nature, the man who was most powerful was able to subjugate others. And he said that everyone should obey, or the social contract theory of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. I was taught by my teachers that the first and the foremost duty of the state is to protect the lives and the properties of all its people. It's strange and disgusting that today in countries after country we see religious minorities are being targeted, and the majoritarian states, in the name of nationalism, in the name of theocracy, or in the name of religion, are mook spectators, silent spectators of this unleashing of violence on vulnerable, on the disadvantaged, those who have numerical inferiority, or those who are powerless in the power structure of the state. If you look at the Indian Constitution, the word minority would occur at 4 places, but no definition has been given. Yet Article 30 talks of 2 kinds of minorities. The religious minorities, that is minorities based on religion, or the linguistic minorities based on language. Now, at any given point of time, you will have more linguistic minorities in India than religious minorities. Whatever rights have been given to the religious minorities are equally available to the linguistic minorities. And therefore, Hindus of UP, if they are in Tamil Nadu or Kerala and they want to set up minority institutions, their Hindi medium institutions will be absolutely minority institutions. There are any number of Hindu Sindhi minority institutions. But the entire discourse on the minority rights in India has been like this, as if only Christians and the Muslims are the minorities, and there is some kind of appeasement of the minorities which has been going on for last 50 years, and we must correct all the wrongs of 50 years or so. We have reached a point where somebody in his private homes, in his fridge, allegedly possesses beef, then he is to be killed in mob violence. An 11-year-old child who is going to celebrate Eid was killed mercilessly in a train apartment, and nobody spoke against these people who are indulging in the worst kind of violence against minorities. In Pune, one technocrat, an engineering graduate, one Mohsin, who was simply wearing a green kurta, and he was killed by people who are returning from a program where provocative speeches were made against the religious minorities. And when these accused were prosecuted, the High Court gave the bail, saying that the accused got provoked because of the religion of the victim, and I take it in favor of the accused. Can you believe we have reached this point in our constitutional history where we are giving an entirely different meaning of law of provocation. When I did criminal law, I was taught that grave and sudden provocation would be a defense to reduce your crime from murder to manslaughter. That's it. What in India we call from culpable homicide amounting to murder to culpable homicide not amounting. The kind of violence which Indian Christians have been facing and the kind of allegations as if they are converting the entire Indian tribal community into Christianity. I always say that look at Article 25, freedom of religion. This right is available not only to Indians, but even to aliens. Therefore, even if foreign Christian missionaries, assuming the not accepting, are on our soil, as per our constitution, they do have a right to propagate Christianity. We have a Supreme Court judgment, absolutely dated, regressive, and erroneous judgment, which says that word propagation in Article 25 does not include the right to convert people. And Supreme Court is not hearing the review of this. We have a presidential order which says if you are not a Hindu, you cannot be entitled to affirmative action benefit of our constitution. And this is an absolute discrimination based on religion. And for decades, our Supreme Court is not listing this case for hearing. Let them list it and decide it whichever way they want to decide. But they are not even deciding this case. So the brief point I want to make this evening is this, that if religious minorities' lives are not secure, their properties are not secure, they are not free to practice their religion, then that means that the state has failed in upholding the social contract, upholding that promise through which the state was brought into existence. And in law of contract, we say if there is a breach of contract, the parties are restored to the original position as if there is no contract. That will be utter anarchy. I believe the way the religion has been used to garner votes, the way the countries after country, example was given of Afghanistan, where there are Muslims who are not Pashtuns, who are discriminated. And when we made our Citizenship Amendment Act, we said we would give citizenship only to Christians and the Parsis and the Hindus and the Sikhs, etc., and excluded Jews and Muslims from that. Of course, in this region, the presence of Jews is hardly there, but Jews and Muslims were not there. If the religious persecution is the reason to give citizenship, whether it is a persecution of follower of X religion or Y religion, doesn't matter, because that is the reason why we want to give citizenship. But this crucial word, religious persecution, strangely is missing from the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019. And now we are doing another mistake. We are saying we will evacuate from Afghanistan only Hindus and Sikhs. What kind of policy is this? I think this is absolute negation of Indian values, absolute negation of classical Hindu values, and absolute negation of the humanity. There are rights available to every human being which are indivisible, which are inalienable, which are non-derogable. I think every neighboring country of Afghanistan should help evacuation of people who want to come out of Afghanistan because of the fear of regressive Taliban regime. But we are saying we will, cherry pick people. Now, this cherry picking of people shows our mentality. I think the framers of Indian Constitution were conscious of this fact, and that is why even Jawaharlal Nehru, who is now the most hated figure in our country. In Young India wrote on 15th of May 1930, and I feel that the occasion like this, when we were commemorating the declaration of the day for people who are being subjected to violence because of their religious beliefs, this is what Nehru had to say. The history of India and many of the countries of the Europe has demonstrated that there can be no stable equilibrium in any country so long as an attempt is made to crush a minority or force it to conform to the ways of the majority. There is no surer method of rousing the resentment of the minority and keeping it apart from the rest of the nation than to make it feel that it has not got the freedom to stick to its own ways. It matters little whether logic is on its side or whether its own particular brand of culture is worthwhile or not. The mere fact of losing it makes it dear. Therefore, we in India must make it clear to all that our policy is based on granting this freedom to the minorities, and that under no circumstance will any coercion or repression of them be tolerated. We can also lay down as our deliberate policy that there shall be no unfair treatment of any minority. Indeed, we should go further and state that it will be the business of the state to give favored treatment to minority and backward community. This was our vision. And it was because of this vision that while Pakistan opted to become a religious theocracy, we opted to become for a modern, rational, liberal democracy. If constitution is a contract between the people, those who opted to live in India and did not go to Pakistan, they opted to live in India because they were promised this kind of freedom. They did not want religion to overtake the state. Religious minorities are not interested in living under a state which is overshadowed by religion or religious slogans. Even in elections, recent in Bengal election and Assam election, from one particular party, they were saying it is 70-30, referring to the 70% of Hindus and 30% of Muslims. I think I am entirely with my predecessor that we are first creating hate, and then this hate results in all kinds of riots and violence and polarization, and then we are able to win elections. Winning and losing of elections should be on the basis of your policies, and your policies as a political party must be consistent with the constitutional vision. I will end my talk with a very, very personal experience. It is going to be another bad night for me tonight, but this is what happened with me. I was a small child in Muradabad, and it was a Eid day. I had a little dispute with my elder brother, and I said, I will not accompany you to Eidgah. Eidgah is a place, it's a big field outside the city where Muslims go and pray after 1 month of fasting. So I had some little quarrel with him, and I said, I will not go with you. So my brother and my father, both of them, went to Eidgah. I did not go. I rather went to a neighborhood mosque to pray. And when I am coming after the prayer, I saw people's dead bodies being carried on shoulders, blood-soaked dead bodies. And I started running. And with much difficulty, I was able to reach home. But my brother and my father could not reach home till 7 p.m. in the evening. They had gone with the district authorities. My brother was in administrative services, so they were safe. But everyone in our locality was saying that probably they have also been killed. Till date, I am telling you, even when I am in Canada or I am in Switzerland or I am in France and the temperature is 0 or -10 or -15, I get nightmares and I sweat like hell. And I'm going to again have this experience because I am sharing this with you this evening. There are so many people like me who had similar experiences, whose houses have been burned, whose family members have been killed because of this mad hate and violence which we are unleashing on our people. I think when India celebrates its 75th independence anniversary, the first and foremost thing we should do, that we should be able to really become a truly secular state where religion will be relegated to a private sphere and the public square will be equally available to everyone. Any political party is free to rule. I think we should not polarize our society. We should not, really try to create hate just because there is an election in UP. The kind of conversations which are going on, or the kind of conversations we had before the Assam and the West Bengal elections, I think it's absolutely disgusting for any modern state. But then even United States with 220 years of their constitutional democracy had this kind of experience during President Trump. Therefore, today, country after country, I am observing that the threat to democracy is not from the dictators. No more you see military coups. The threat to democracy today is from the ballot box or from the EVM, because we are electing people who do not believe in the equality of human beings. We are electing people who are authoritarian. We are electing people who don't want to include everyone in spite of all kinds of slogans. I think no country with such a huge majority as India, where you have a big minority, can really tackle the question of the minority without taking them on board. Even if there are some small minorities, maybe you can do something like that, but we are not living in 30s and 40s. So what happened in Germany cannot be repeated anymore. And if that is not going to happen, we cannot get rid of our minorities. Then I think we must implement the constitutional vision. We have been saying that Christians are converting tribals. Why Christian population is not going up then? I believe that the places of the worship of all religious minorities are to be protected. The freedom of religion as guaranteed by the Constitution must be implemented to the fullest extent, and the right to life which is available to everyone, whether you are an Indian or a non-Indian, or right to religion which is available to everyone, whether you are a citizen or a non-citizen, and right to equality which under Article 14 is available to citizens as well as non-citizens. At least these must be guaranteed, and we should be able to build a stronger nation, and that stronger nation would require that we follow the policy of salad bowl, where the distinctive identities of all the communities are reflected. All our institutions reflect the diversity of the society. Our constitution does not believe, like United States, in the melting pot theory. We believe in the salad bowl theory. I think India is all about diversity. Let us celebrate our diversities. Let us remove this hate. We are a country of non-violence. I really don't know why in last few years we are becoming so violent and our conversations have become so hateful. Thank you very much.